the existing first homeowner grant is going to double from $15,000 to $30,000. Now, the government reckons this initiative will help about 12,000 buyers to unlock their first home before it expires in 2025. But one of Australia's leading economists, Saul Eslake, has seen through the spin, and he hasn't minced words when asked to respond to the government's claim that the policy did not and will not put the price of properties up to free up existing stock. Saul summed it up in one word: bullshit. So that's pretty simple. I mean, he pointed to 60 years of evidence that giving cash to home buyers resulted in more expensive housing, not in more people actually owning their own home. I tell you what, I'm with Saul Eslake. Saul, thanks for joining us this morning. You've been fairly scathing in your assessment of this announcement as well. I think you called it BS. What's your take?
Well, I probably shouldn't have used
That's all right.
that I was quoted as saying, and I'm certainly not going to on your program. Thank you for having me on it. But look, I've been around long enough to know that long enough to feel that it's hard to think of any policy in any area of public policy that governments of all political persuasions have pursued for so long in the face of such incontrovertible evidence that it doesn't work as the policy of giving cash to aspiring first-time home buyers in the belief that it will lift the home ownership rate. I mean, yes, the lucky small number of thousands who get the grant will be better off, or at least they will think they'll be better off. But the cash doesn't end up in their pockets. It ends up in the pockets of the people who sell the established houses or flats, if that's what they buy, or the builders who build a new home for them if they choose to go down that path. And I say this because the history of these schemes goes back to 1964, when Sir Robert Menzies introduced the first home savings grant, as it was then called, ironically at the urging of the then president of the New South Wales Young Liberals, whose name was John Howard, and he took it to the 1963 election. I don't think it's a coincidence that Australia's home ownership rate peaked at the census of 1966 at about 72% and has been going down ever since. Because what the history tells us, and there have been any number of variants and iterations of this particular scheme over the years, just the numbers keep getting bigger. I mean, when Menzies first introduced his scheme, the grant was, I think, £150, or what was then $300. You had to be under 35, you had to be married or engaged, you had to have saved with an approved bank or building society for at least 2 years to have accumulated a 20% deposit, etc. And you got $300 towards the cost of a first home. When that was abolished by the Whitlam government, it was reintroduced by the Fraser government, it was abolished by the Hawke government. Then when John Howard introduced the GST, he insisted that the states make first homeowner grants of $7,000, supposedly to compensate for the fact that GST was going to be levied on the purchase of new homes, which it was. It wasn't levied on the purchase of established dwellings, but eligible applicants nonetheless got the $7,000 for that. Kevin Rudd doubled it during the global financial crisis, and state governments have, at different times, increased the grants to as much as $30,000 now in Queensland. You can get something similar in Tasmania. At one stage, if you bought a house in regional Victoria, you could get $35,000 from the Victorian government as well as $14,000 from the federal government at the time. Now, has any of this resulted in an arrest of the downward trend in home ownership? The answer is no. And what the history tells us is that any scheme that allows people to pay more for housing than they'd be able to without those schemes results in more expensive housing, not in more people owning that housing. In fact, it results in fewer people owning that housing. And you just sort of have to ask yourself, why do governments keep doing things in this area that so patently don't work? And if you'll forgive the cynicism, my conclusion is that governments, and again, I'm not singling out the Queensland Labor government for this, governments of all political persuasions, know that for all the crocodile tears they shed for the people who struggle and often fail to get their first foot on their home ownership ladder, in any given year across the nation, there are typically only about 100,000 of them. whereas there are at any point in time at least 11 million Australians who own at least one property, typically their own home, but about 15% of taxpayers own at least one investment property. And they like governments to do things that keep house prices going up, preferably at a faster rate than people's incomes. So the policy has worked to achieve the unstated objective of rewarding those who already own property, and the people who've lost out are the people that these schemes are ostensibly designed to help. But in fact, except for the lucky few who manage to qualify for the grants, are disadvantaged by them.
All right, so it doesn't help the first home buyers, and it pushes up the prices in the market, but you're already sitting pretty well, pretty cooked.
Well, indeed, and as I say, because there are so many more people who benefit from schemes that have the effect of pushing prices up, which first homeowner grants do. I often say these things should be called second home vendor grants rather than first homeowner grants, because that's where the money ends up, or builders and land developers profit margin expansion grants, because that's where the money ends up. There are many, many more of those, and they vote, than there are would-be first home buyers. And so, as I say, politicians of all political stripes shed crocodile tears for them, but then go about doing things that the overwhelming body of evidence going back almost more than 60 years tells us doesn't achieve the stated objective, but in fact produces a perverse outcome.
What measures would actually help get first home buyers into houses and on the first rung on the ladder?
Well, there's an old saying that when you're in a hole, the first thing you've got to do is to stop digging. And we're in the hole we are with regard to home ownership, because beginning with that scheme that Sir Robert Menzies introduced in the 1960s, and in contrast to the policies which governments of both political persuasions pursued from the end of the Second World War until the mid-1960s, early 70s, governments have been promoting policies that inflate the demand for housing, such as first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions, tax breaks for landlords, easier access to credit, guarantees of deposits and all that sort of thing, all of which serve to inflate the demand for housing, and maintaining relatively high rates of immigration, which you might defend on other grounds, but certainly has an impact on the demand for housing, and especially as we're seeing at the moment on house prices and rents. At the same time, and this is mainly state and local governments, have done their best to restrict the supply of housing through zoning and land use regulation, and through reducing the amount until recent years that they've been putting into the construction of social housing compared with what they used to do in the post-war decades. So we've had complete failures of policy on both the demand and supply side of the housing market. We need to stop policies like the ones announced by the Queensland Government over the weekend that inflate the demand for housing needlessly and put money in the pockets of people who already own housing, and instead do more to boost supply. Now, that's easy to say. I mean, obviously, houses take a long time to build, and apartments take even longer to build. So it's easy to say that, but in the long run, the only sustainable solution, the only answers to the question, what do we need to do to reverse the decline, and it's a substantial decline among people under the age of 45, home ownership rates, is to stop pursuing policies that don't work and instead focus in particular on boosting the supply of housing.
So they're talking about it being able to assist about 12,000 people, but looking around the market, I don't know if you're trying to buy a new house and land for under 750,000, I don't know whether there's going to be much of an uptake on it. I don't know if there's much of that stock available anywhere.
Well, yeah, and that's another problem with these schemes, of course, although the government would probably say that by putting an upper limit on it, they're trying to contain the impact that it has on prices. 12,000 people is still a reasonable proportion of the number of properties that change hands in Queensland every year. So that was why I responded in that colourful way I did to the suggestion that Treasury was apparently trying to make that this wouldn't have any impact on house prices at all. As I say, that flies in the face of almost 60 years of evidence to the contrary. as I say, it's hard to run away from the thought that the reason governments of all political persuasions keep doing this is because they value the votes of people with property far more than they value the votes of people without property, if only on the grounds that there are far more of the first group than the second.
Yeah. All right, brilliant. Lovely to talk with you. Thanks very much for your insights as well. Saul Eslake, independent economist. What did you make of what Saul had to say and his breakdown on that? It's what we suspected that it was, but it's there for re-election purposes, but interesting that it's not so much attracting the young, but attracting all of the, I think he said 11 million people that have properties because it keeps their property prices up, it keeps them at a nice level.